hashtag AssemblyEnv and hashtag Cold Homes. Please may I remind members, guests and people in the audience to turn their phones off or put them on silent, and that's not vibrate, that's actually silent. And can I ask, do we have any apologies for this meeting?
Thank you, Chair. We've received apologies for absence from Assembly Member Curtin and Assembly Member Arnold, for whom Assembly Member Shah is substituting.
Thank you very much. And in terms of declarations of interest, are there any, if you can note the list of offices on the report, but are there any additional interests to declare? No. Thank you very much, members. And in terms of our minutes, can I ask the committee to agree the minutes of the 8th of November 2018 meeting as a correct record? Agreed. Excellent. And do we, finally, in terms of the summary list of actions, can the committee please note the list of completed and outstanding actions from previous meetings?
Noted.
Thank you very much. So this brings us to the main business of today, which is our discussion on issues relating to cold and damp homes in London. I'd like to welcome our guests. We have Bill Wright, who is the Sustainability Consultant for Sustainable Homes. We have Peter Rickaby, who is Energy and Sustainability Consultant and Chair of the BSI Retrofit Standards Task Group. We have Liz Blackwell, who is the Energy Manager at L&Q Energy. We have George Sims, who is the Project Manager for Energy Efficiency here at the GLA. And we have Ben Coombes, who is the Programme Manager for Energy Renew for the GLA as well. So welcome to all of you. Thank you very much indeed. And so this particular scrutiny has come about. Many members have constituents who are suffering from the problems of cold and damp and mouldy homes, and we wanted to have a look at the issues that flow from that, and whether there are any things that we could be doing differently across London in order that people have homes that are fit to live in and that you can actually live in, even if you're living in overcrowded conditions. So, sorry, just looking for my actual question. Yes. Can I start by asking all of you, but I'll start at this end with Bill, can you briefly outline the problem of damp in hard-to-heat homes and what you see as good practice in addressing it? That's a sort of a brief summary to start us off.
Well, the problem varies very much on... we did a study called Breaking the Mould recently, which was about trying to really get to the bottom of why mould is caused. So we looked at homes that... We looked at the reasons why some homes had it and some homes didn't. A landlord typically might have, let's say they have an estate of 200 homes, and about 20 out of those 200 have a serious mould problem. Now the landlord might typically think, in that case, if 180 aren't suffering, then the 20 people who are suffering are probably doing something wrong. So we wanted to try and get to the bottom of that, and we did a piece of research that looked at that examined using big data, and it looked at all sorts of things from the occupancy level of the homes to the relative ages, whether they had issues with respiratory conditions, whether they had pets, and we also cross-analysed this with asset management data from the landlords that owned them. And what we found predominantly was that the homes that suffered most were the homes that had the most people in them. And that's fairly easy to understand, because the more people there are in a home, the more likely it is that, the more people there are to be breathing, to be showering, to be cooking, and contributing to the moisture levels in the home. So the more people, the more moisture there is, and the more there is to get rid of. So if there's only a few people, then it's unlikely to reach the levels of condensation that are that are going to cause a problem. As for what to do to solve it, I think that we need to look at at who traditionally takes responsibility for mould, and that the current accepted practice is that mould is the landlord's responsibility if it's as a result of a building defect, for example, a failed damp-proof course or a leak, but it's the tenant's responsibility if it's a result of condensation that's caused by a lack of ventilation or by poor heating. But in practice, condensation can arguably always be solved by lots of ventilation or lots of heating. The question should be how much heating is an acceptable level, and if they have to use an inordinate amount of fuel to create that level, then it's arguably down to the landlord to insulate the home better.
Thank you. That's a great summary to start us off. Peter, can I bring you in at this point?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Bill said, actually. And I'm thinking of the example of the work we did in Thamesmead, where we had identical homes next door to each other, where some had mould and some didn't. And it was entirely, as you suggested, due to levels of occupancy. In fact, we risk assessed all the homes on the estate there, and the factor that the incidence of condensation and mould was most associated with was occupancy. And you left out of your list, actually, doing the laundry and drying the laundry at night as well.
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Lots of. The thing I would add is that we're not very good at ventilation. And most ventilations in this country are designed to the very minimum flat ventilation level that the building regulations set, if that. And it's not good enough for homes that have got more than minimum occupancy, more than the number of bed spaces that it's designed for example. So we need to get better at that, and I've been trying to communicate to people that a good ventilation system is one that doesn't get turned off. And people, even in cold, damp homes, often turn off the ventilation system because they perceive it as noisy, drafty, and using their money. You know, the fact that it's going around and making a noise makes them think it's spending my money. It's getting rid of my heat that I've just struggled to put into the house. So I think it's terrifically important that we find ways of ventilating homes that are efficient and quiet and have sufficient capacity to deal with big changes in occupancy, not just, say, during the day, but over longer periods as well. So if we could do that, I think we'd be a long way towards alleviating the problem.
If we can do that affordably and...
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, and I think the route to affordable is we're never going to have enough money to fix the fuel poverty problem in London in the foreseeable future. But if we can risk assess the stock in a meaningful way that allows us to deploy the resources in the right places, and certainly one of the lessons from Thamesmead for me was that you can't just say that block needs some work, because in that block there might be 4 or 5 homes where there are 2 people with jobs, they've got plenty of income, they can keep it warm, and it's fine, it's clean. And then there's another home where there's no income coming except benefits, it's perhaps over-occupied, or it's on a kind of chaotic occupancy pattern, and that's the one where the condensation and mould are. So we need to have quite a sophisticated way of assessing how to deploy our resources. And just going for one block or one estate isn't going to work.
And that's going to be dynamic based on...
Yes.
Probably based on occupancy levels.
Yes, and we learned at Thamesmead that what you risk assess as low risk might turn into high risk next year, because somebody else joins the household, or somebody loses a job, or whatever it might be, and suddenly their circumstances are different. And ultimately, it's all because cold and damp homes are a symptom of fuel poverty, and fuel poverty is a symptom of a mismatch of income with the efficiency of the home. But you don't change the home every time your circumstances change, so the home needs to be able to respond, or at least we need to be able to respond to assist.
And actually, if it's a household that's not in work, there's going to be more people occupying the home for more hours of the day, so the condensation
and also things
will
like
be worse.
Young children at home with a parent, where they're doing more washing, they're there more of the day. Homes with a young couple who both work and don't have any children don't usually have damp and mold problems. It's homes that have larger families who are there most of the time for one reason or another.
Mm-hmm. So people who have to live in their homes.
Sure.
And yes.
I think we absolutely cannot tell people what their occupancy pattern should be. I think we have to do it the other way around. We have to give them the opportunity to operate the home, whatever their circumstances, in an efficient and healthy way, and let them take it from there.
Yes. Liz?
We're obviously a housing trust, so we provide housing to sort of a variety of residents across London. And we see the significance of the issue.
Speak up a little, please.
Sorry. We see the issue of damp and cold homes on our residents on a regular basis, sort of day to day. We get people calling up about the problems, and we really see it's a very complex issue. Generally, we do find there's a clear link with the way that people use their homes, and I would echo what the gentlemen have said about the link with sort of occupancy and things like that. But we have done quite a lot of work recently to look at the link with other areas of how it might affect our residents. We see a huge correlation with people who we believe are in fuel poverty, and also with SAP scores. Really, there's also quite a lot of significant correlation between that and people who are in arrears, and also number of complaints that we get. So of all the queries that we get and complaints as they start coming through, the ones that have keywords of mould and damp in them are the most likely to then exhibit as complaints in the future out of all of the initial queries that we get on our properties. That's most significant. In terms of good practice, we think that having good processes and good quality, consistent help and appropriate advice is really key, right from the first contact that residents make with us. And we are looking at our long-term energy efficiency targets and improving our homes. We are cautious sometimes about doing particular measures, for example, solid wall insulation, because we worry about some of the inadvertent impacts that could have on people's damp problems if they already exist. So I think having good quality installation of insulation and ventilation is so important. And having good contractors and good consultants who work with you throughout the process is really key to that. Thank you. And George, can I bring you in?
Yeah, I'd echo really what the other panellists have said so far, and highlight really, as the London Environment Strategy does, the importance of improving the energy performance of our homes. But to quote directly from Peter, I think what we need to do is build tight, which means insulate and reduce energy demand, and ventilate right. So whenever we're doing energy efficiency works to homes, we need to make sure that ventilation is appropriate. I think there's one other thing that I'd add to the list of common issues, and that's general property conditions, so where it means there's lots of leaks and so on, where people haven't been able to afford to repair those leaks. That might mean walls are wet. Wet walls are generally colder, so problems are exacerbated there. And it means that if we're thinking about installing any retrofit measures in a home, those issues need to be fixed as well. So when we consider energy efficiency projects, we need to not only look at what the energy requirements of the house are, but what the general needs, general condition of the home are as well, if we're going to get the right outcomes. Because there's no point in installing insulation that's then going to get wet and contribute to a problem rather than to fix a problem. So
you're talking there about installing insulation rather than retrofitting ventilation.
Well, both. So we need to think about ventilation when we're doing insulation as well. But obviously, if you are insulating, you've got a lower heat demand. You're less likely to run into some of those issues around condensation, damp that you might have otherwise, provided that you're making sure that the ventilation is right. So In terms of best practice, I think we need to have a process of assessing the whole home and not just looking at what energy efficiency measures need to be installed. So that's looking at general conditions, so things like leaks, damp, whether that's caused by water ingress or whether it's caused by condensation. Then we need to develop a whole house plan, and that doesn't mean doing everything we possibly can do at once. It means having an idea for how we get that home to a state where it costs much less to heat, where it's fit for purpose, fit for 2050. That includes risk assessment. So where any measures are being installed, it means looking at what the potential risks are to increase or exacerbate a problem and avoid that. It then means making sure that the correct contractor standards are in place and that measures are installed properly. And it means a level of quality assurance. And there's a particular role, we think, on energy efficiency projects, which is really important, and that's a retrofit coordinator, who's somebody who's an independent expert that understands all of the issues, that can assess what the needs are for that home, that can oversee the contractor, and that can make sure that any interventions are appropriate. So that's something that we think is very important.
Can I ask, does the GLA take on board occupancy within the risk assessment, or are you looking at homes just as a fixed thing, irrespective of the occupancy? Is that one of the factors the GLA?
It is. I mean, generally we're looking at a particular current occupancy in the existing building, but we're mindful that that will change, as Peter says. You know, a home that could be low risk today might be high risk tomorrow, depending on a change of occupancy. And I think as far as ventilation goes, one of the things that I think is generally good practice is making sure that that ventilation system is demand controlled, which means increasing ventilation according to things like relative humidity. So as the air gets damper, the ventilation rate increases. If there's less moisture in the air, you can drop the ventilation rate, which means that you're minimising some of the heat losses. So I think making sure that ventilation systems are fit for purpose is really important. And I think too often when you go into homes, you'll find that ventilation systems are connected to a light switch. They might be switched off because people don't like the noise. They're not really fit for purpose. So we're trying to ensure that ventilation systems that are designed alongside energy efficiency measures are fit for purpose to make sure that you can take account of those occupancy things and changes in
and
moisture
being
levels.
fit for purpose, does that include cheap to run as well? Because presumably if you're talking about a household in fuel poverty, turning off the fan, people may think that they're going to save money.
That's right, and that's about the additional support that you provide around installing measures, which is again where the role of a retrofit coordinator is very important, because it may be that people worry about the ventilation, but it might be explaining that actually the costs of running that system might not be that great, but the benefits in terms of internal air quality, minimising moisture risks, will be quite significant. If you're then installing those things alongside other energy saving measures, then on balance, you know, the occupant will be better off.
Thank you. Ben, can I just get you in on the introduction summary?
Yeah, thanks. I won't waste too much of our time here because I completely agree with what the other panellists have said. I suppose just to zoom back out from some of the very good detail George has given, I think from what Peter says in terms of we need to give people the opportunity to live in their homes healthily and affordably, and along with your comment there on fit for purpose, I think that is just about the baseline thing, so adequate heating system, insulated to a reasonable standard, and a good level of insulation. If we can get those things right, then the occupancy factors are another thing to be dealt with, but we need to be giving this baseline opportunity to people.
Thank you. So then, if you could each also comment on any particular points you have in terms of retrofitting homes to make them easier to heat, and at the same time, any comments on whether retrofitting can actually have an unwanted side effect of actually increasing the problems of damp and mould. I don't know, Peter, do you want to start?
Yes. Well, the conventional wisdom for dealing with fuel poverty and with damp is you have to do insulation and improve the efficiency of the heating and do ventilation. And I used to sign up to that for a long time, but I'm beginning to be sceptical about it, mostly because the insulation is becoming so expensive as a measure to do once we've filled all the cavities and done all the lofts. So as you know, at Thamesbury we didn't do any insulation, but we did lots of ventilation. So it does seem to me that there's a balance to be struck and that there are horses for courses depending on particular homes. I would never be an advocate of not insulating, but if it's too difficult or too expensive, then absolutely yes, we could look at other measures. What we need to do is to make the heating more affordable. If you make the heating more affordable by making it more efficient and better control, and then you ventilate properly, you can get away to some degree with less insulation. And that may be something that needs doing when there's a shortage of resources. The defects thing is interesting. I've spent most of the last 5 years working on the Each Home Counts review and then for the BSA Retrofit Standards Task Group, and we've really been doing work that's the whole review was a response to serious defects in retrofitted homes. And it's mostly about things like rainwater penetration behind external insulation, condensation on cold walls behind internal insulation because the moist air inside's managed to get behind the insulation board through poor sealing, and a whole load of other defects of that kind. So we've been writing a new standard called PAS 2035, Publicly Available Specification 2035, to try and deal with that. And in the near future, well, in about 18 months, the ECO programme will require the use of the Trustmark Quality Mark, and the Trustmark Quality Mark will require the PAS 2035 standard. And so we're hoping that we can achieve a step change in the quality of work that's done with any publicly funded retrofit, for any publicly funded retrofit. At the moment, the government's, central government's commitment is only to attach those standards to ECO. But there is an aspiration that came out of the Each Home Counts review to get to all sectors. So housing associations, city authorities, all of them, if we could get them to adopt the Trustmark and therefore the standards, the new technical standards, that would go a long way to making sure that we could, it would restore the confidence, I think, of both the public and the government in doing retrofit properly.
And these new technical standards for doing retrofit properly, what's different in terms of what the previous standards were?
Quite a lot of what George said applies. That essentially, what we've had for most of the last 15, 20 years is an industry that delivers single measures. Somebody comes over the horizon with a bag of money that's labelled loft insulation or cavity wall insulation or whatever it might be, and that's what gets done to the house. And there's a certain amount of discussion about applicability, but it's not really very good. What the new standards require is that the house is properly assessed, that having made an assessment, that the options for improvement are looked at and the best ones are identified, that somebody looks at what does that house need for the next over 30 years or so to get it to where we need it to be in the middle of the century, and then we have a plan which we can set out towards. And clearly incidents of fuel poverty, incidents of condensation and mould would affect the assessment and the plan, but that's a more systematic way to do it. It adds a bit of overhead to all of the programmes. So, for instance, a programme like Renew would probably find the unit cost was a little bit higher. It kind of assumes a different business model from what we've used for doing improvements in the past. The business model in the past has been to roll out these single measure programmes. What we need to carry the overhead of assessing properly and doing a proper plan and evaluating the options properly, and then having the retrofit coordinator to do the quality assurance work, is we need to bundle the measures into packages so that we're getting multi-measure improvements to each home at one time, in order that there's enough margin for the installer in that to carry the overhead of doing the work properly. So it's about a different business model. And what we're trying to do in the 18-month transition from early next year to late 2020 to these new standards is to encourage the industry to move through a series of joint ventures, partnerships, mergers, cooperatives, whatever, towards a different structure which is not predicated on chasing single measures money all over the place, but rather on doing whole dwelling assessment exactly as George described and then moving from there.
And does that include potentially, say, looking at an estate and just treating some homes and not all homes? Because
Yes.
presumably when they were rolling out single measures, you know, whether it's cavity wall insulation or whatever, they were doing it across a whole estate.
Yes.
Are you suggesting that this newer way of working would be a
Well,
bit more targeted than that?
Yes and no. I'm not against doing the whole estate. We obviously have to do it eventually. But when you have limited resources, it's more about how can we target those resources appropriately. And certainly the work for Peabody has taught me that just because two houses on an estate look the same doesn't mean they are the same or that they've got the same problems. So once you start to risk assess, it may be that the programme then visits an estate of houses in different orders.
Mm-hmm.
So the ones with the highest risk now and the ones with lower risk later, something of that kind.
Yeah, thank you. Bill, do you want to add anything?
We looked at a major retrofit project that took place in Coventry, and we did a before and after study. It was a project where they fitted external wall insulation to about 300 homes, and we went in before they did it and did some temperature and humidity monitoring, and then we went in after they'd completed the works and did the same thing again. And we looked at a number of different KPIs, and there were a wide variety of improvements. People were finding that their homes were a lot less drafty, a lot more attractive because of the EWI. It was a prefabricated estate, and it looked terrible before and it looked wonderful afterwards. So it had impacts on people's perceptions of security after dark as well. But having done all this, I thought, all right, well, now let's look at the humidity. Because if they're less drafty, then surely the humidity has gone up. So we looked at all the data, we thought, and we realised that the humidity had gone down in every instance. And so I went back to the contractors and said, what's happened here? I said, oh yeah, we forgot to tell you, we installed silent extractor fans in the kitchens and bathrooms. And because they were silent, they hadn't had any complaints at all. That the residents absolutely loved them and were very happy throughout. One other thing that I wanted to make about extract fans is that people have a misconception about the energy losses as a result of ventilation. In a typical home, some numbers coming up. In a typical home through the winter, you may be using about 40 kilowatt hours of heating per day. If you are using enough ventilation to adequately ventilate that home, which is probably about 8 to 10 air changes, that amounts to a little under 20% of that total. So people don't realise that ventilating it properly is far, far less of a cost than is simply going out through leaky walls and windows and just passing through uninsulated walls generally.
So there's a job to be done of actually explaining to people how
Yes.
these systems work so that they don't kind of
Yes, so they
kind of ill-advisedly turn things off that
Exactly.
are actually helping them to make their home
Exactly
easier
that, yes.
easier to live in. Does anyone else want to add anything further? Liz?
In terms of this easy measures, we've pretty much got there with those, cavity wall and loft insulation. We've also had some success with solid wall insulation where it's been done alongside other estate renewal programs. We find that actually if you do the measures alongside windows, doors, heating systems, you increase the success because you've got contractors on board who see the whole picture. We struggle with older solid wall properties, sort of Victorian properties. We've done some retrofit through the TSB funding in Innovate UK. It was about 5-6 years ago, something like that. And a big problem we've had is that there's a lack of predictable market. So you've got people who'd be working on your properties now who may go into administration or may be swallowed up by other companies and things like that. And I think the ups and downs of the funding that's available with ECO, and at the moment no one's quite sure how that's going to work. It means that the supply chain is a lot less predictable, and I think properties like Victorian properties are very complex in terms of doing these kinds of works. You really have to have people who know what they're doing, and I think there's a huge amount of potential for an increase in the skills in the industry as we ramp up energy efficiency.
So a bit of training. A bit of training.
I mean, the retrofit coordinators course is great. Yeah. It's a contractor side as well. I think is really important to focus on, and giving them the surety that the work is going to keep coming through, and it's worth investing in those skills.
Yeah, George, you're nodding.
Yeah, I think I agree with all those points again, but just to sort of re-emphasise one of the points that Peter made about each home being slightly different and requiring a slightly different set of remediation measures or to bring it up to an adequate standard in terms of both ventilation and heat loss. That means that yes, you'll be able to get quite a long way with some homes and you won't be able to get quite as far with others, but I think it really underlines the need for an in-depth understanding of each dwelling and not just seeing things, taking a blanket approach to things, which means that you need to understand the risks and manage those. And yes, it can add cost, potentially, but the counter to that is that the costs are always somewhere, and I think the evidence from each home counts, and particularly one case that's sort of notorious in energy efficiency circles is an external wall insulation project in Preston, where that cutting costs, lack of attention to detail, has had some really poor outcomes for the occupants, and they're the ones that actually end up bearing the costs in the end, and the landlord who's had to undertake a lot of remediation for those. So adding on cost for sort of design and oversights and quality assurance is something that we need to do to make sure that the other costs, which might be building defects, it might even be reduced health or health impacts for the occupants of the building, are minimised.
Assembly Member Cooper is going to be coming in with a bit more on that just now, so I'll leave you to pick that up, Leonie. But just, Ben, did you want to come in on anything in terms, sort of specifically on this?
I would just say, again, I agree with all what's been said from the other panellists. And I think I'd just like to add that the MEL programmes that we have in this space, Warmer Homes, Renew, and the programme which will succeed Renew next year, are all designed to move into this space with the cutting edge of the industry in terms of not just focusing on single measures, not ignoring the wider picture, whole house retrofit, taking into account that one size does not fit all. So particularly the programme that will succeed Renew this coming year takes full advantage of the things that the industry has learned in the last couple of years, these new technical standards that Peter mentioned in PAS 2035, and just to say the MEL programmes are on board and fully trying to move into this space to be cutting edge.
You in now,
yes.
Leonie.
So we started out with Bill talking about the situation where we've got overcrowding, and that is a problem that we're not just about to solve overnight. And then we've moved on to talking about a lot of building interventions, external wall insulation, internal wall insulation, improving windows and doors, and so on and so forth. But I mean, obviously we do then run the risk of exacerbating dampness if we don't at the same time improve the ventilation. And both Peter and Bill have talked about the issue of the human interface with the ventilation. And one of the issues that came up a lot when we were visiting Thamesmead and looking at which were the properties where the interventions had gone in first. The highest risk properties tended to be the ones that were most overcrowded, or people were doing the most extensive cooking, largest numbers of children at home. So I just want to come back to the sort of the human side of this. What programmes are being run in terms of behaviour change? Because I still think we run the risk, if all we do is focus on the insulation side and trying to heat buildings, if we don't solve the interface between people around behaviour change and making sure that they don't turn the ventilation off as being part of that process. And I just wondered, I mean, certainly I was thinking of Worthing Homes Bill and their study where they showed that actually you got better results in terms of the buildings if you gave advice to the residents as well as doing works to the buildings.
To be honest, I'm not aware of very much that's going on in terms of education for residents at present. There are some housing associations that I'm aware of who are running programs along these lines, but my experience is that landlords largely consider behaviour change exercises as very difficult at best. Trying to tell people how to live their lives does not get a lot of success. If there's another way of approaching behaviour change and providing advice, possibly on a one-to-one level, but even then it needs to be presented in a very sort of non-judgmental, non-confrontational way. I think that's probably the best approach. I think that it's important that the question of blame is considered correctly, and I feel that it's important to try to accept what the reasons are for the damp and mould before telling the resident exactly how to live their lives, because there are a number of reasons for the way that they behave in the way that they do. That if they're drying their clothes indoors, it may well be because they have no outside space in which to dry it. They may keep their windows closed because they live on the ground floor and they have security concerns about opening them. And so there needs to be a very good understanding of what a particular resident's issues are that contribute to the moisture.
Do you agree with that, Peter, or do you want to add something else?
I was going to reinforce that, really. At Thamesmead, we made sure that every single household got energy advice, and irrespective of what other interventions they get. And the people who get interventions get 2 visits, one within 3 weeks of the intervention, and one within the next year to sort of follow up. And what Bill said about the housing associations not being committed to it is absolutely true. As we started the Thamesmead programme, the housing association was sort of making the advice team redundant, and we had to really fight back and rescue the advice team and get them trained properly and focused. And I wouldn't want to run that programme without the advice. There is some quite old research now by Metropolitan Housing where they had some estates, 3 estates that they did work on. Well, one estate they did work on and gave advice, one estate they did work on and didn't give advice, and one where they just gave advice. And actually what it seemed to show is that when you don't give the advice, you get about half the predicted energy savings from the intervention, because half of it's dependent on whether the people operate the house in a particular way. But the good bit was that if you just give the advice and you don't do anything to the houses, you still get half the savings, which suggests there's a lot of buried results out there that we could just release with a good advice programme. So I think
it's pretty much what the Worthing Homes study showed as well, that
yes.
The houses where you just did the building works, the results in terms of improved reduction in fuel poverty and reduction in bills was not as good as the ones where you only gave people advice. Obviously the ones where you did the building works and gave advice had the best results, but it's quite interesting that actually advice in some cases improved things more than very expensive building interventions.
Yes, and I don't think you have to go as far as telling people how to live in their homes. And I'm a great believer in people. I know that every household lives in their home in an entirely different way, and anybody who tries to define occupancy patterns for any purposes is always wrong, because there's always far more chaos out there. So I think good advice is around, do you know how to work the ventilation system? Do you know how important it is? Do you know the implications of turning it off? Do you know how to work your heating system? Do you know how to work the controls? Have you got the right tariff? Have you got the right fuel? Have you got the right supplier? It's those kind of things that we can do right away. And that's not really saying you should be living in a particular way or keeping the home at a certain temperature or whatever it might be. It's actually just making sure they've got the knowledge to be able to run the home efficiently if that's what they choose to do. Having said that, some of the best interventions are ones that don't need any engagement by the occupants. So, for instance, the demand control ventilation in Thamesmead is entirely without controls, and we actually put the on-off switch for it inside the boxing, so it's not visible, and it just gets on with it. The same with the smart heating controllers there, the switches. The occupants don't have to interact with the controls. They can if they want. They can make it warmer or cooler or turn it on or off. But if they just have other priorities in their life and ignore it, it will get on with keeping the home in a good, comfortable state. And I think we need to find those kind of technologies that will do that work for us and are robust against lack of interest by people who've got other things to do with their lives.
Absolutely. So Liz, so what's L&Q doing around this sort of area in terms of energy advice for people so that they can manage their homes, and also in terms of the devices that can be fitted that perhaps people don't need to pay any attention to, that will help keep their home warm and comfortable, and at a reasonable price that they can afford, and doesn't encourage cold and damp and mould?
Yeah, so we've had a lot of success with energy saving engagement programs in the past, and we started adding advice on mould and damp into those visits. But what is evident is that you have to catch it really early, and you have to have the process in right from the beginning when people move in or when they first sort of tell us about the problem. We have just set up a working group which is across different departments, so it's our maintenance team who actually deal with the mould and damp problems on the ground, our energy efficiency project manager, business improvement managers, and they're working together to try different approaches that maybe we haven't done before. And we've put £700,000 towards this, and that will be spent over the next sort of financial year. And part of that will be trying out a few different technologies that are out there, or things that maybe aren't out there yet. So we'll be trying switching potentially, and other smart thermostats. We'll be trying mini dehumidifiers. I've got a list of them here. Condensation traps, damp and mould sensors, window sensors, things like that. Working with residents who have told us about problems and that we know about, to see if there are any in particular that work really well, and which ones maybe don't work so well.
The evidence that we were looking at in Thamesmead is that these very minor, not very costly to run interventions that were installed, and then some advice to the residents living in the homes, probably massively decreased the calls on the maintenance teams, who previously have been going out on a very regular basis to try and deal with endless calls about condensation and mould and damp homes. Is that the sort of balance that you're sort of going more for the preventative end?
It's partly that. I mean, it has to be put alongside actually recognising when there is a problem with the way that a building's been built, or lack of insulation and things. So we need to make sure that if there is a real problem with a lack of insulation on a sloping ceiling or something like that, that we are actually dealing with that quickly and effectively before the problem gets worse as well. So I think it's a combination of the two, to be honest.
Yes, I'm not suggesting that we stop insulating homes or putting in new controllable heating systems or anything like that. So in terms of, turning to George and Ben, in terms of what the GLA is doing, to make the energy efficiency measures that we've been installing through these programmes work as effectively as possible, and to make the programmes go as far as possible, have we thought about adding on energy advice? Is that going to be part of the package that's going to be on offer from Energy for Londoners when it's launched?
Well, actually, we're already doing some of this through Warmer Homes. So I've highlighted the role of the retrofit coordinator before, and Peter suggested that one of the best ways in making sure that the outcomes are appropriate for each house is understanding what people's issues are. So the very first thing that people do when they have their application approved through Warmer Homes is the retrofit coordinator, who's someone that's assigned to them for the duration of the job, gives them a call and asks them a bit about their home, what the issues are that they might be experiencing, and what they think needs to happen. And so in that sense, we're not saying this is what we think needs to be done to your home. We'll be advising, but actually it's also getting someone else's input. And that's important.
How many people have been helped through Warmer Homes so far then, since it was launched?
Over 300 over 300 installs so far.
300?
Yeah.
Are we thinking of working in partnership with anybody else? I mean, I know that certainly some of the community energy organisations who've received some funding through the Mayor's Community Energy Fund, for example, are sort of recycling some of the money that comes from their installs into setting up energy cafes so that they can give people advice. So are we thinking of extending it? Because 300, I think there's probably more than...
Again, we are already...
That's a small percentage, isn't it?
It is, but we are already doing that through the Fuel Poverty Support Fund, which is supporting boroughs who are working with local community groups who are doing those sorts of things already. But just going back to Warmer Homes for a moment, I think the approach that's taken means that the things that get installed are appropriate. So I think particularly when controls, it's really important to have controls that are simple or intuitive. You know, that's accompanied by advice so that somebody isn't left with a really complex thermostat or programmer that they don't know how to use, and actually, well, it just gets put on one setting which might be on rather than something that's more intuitive. A couple of the things that Peter's mentioned on Thamesmead, demand controlled ventilation and switchy smart thermostats, which also monitor relative humidity. Those are being installed through Warmer Homes. But yes, you know, the Fuel Poverty Support Fund is increasing the number of people that we reach, supporting local community groups that are working with people already, have that understanding of the people that they work with, and can tailor advice to make sure it's appropriate and understandable.
And, I mean, obviously we've had both the Green Deal, which was a huge success, and also Eco, which wasn't really very successful in London. Clearly there are specific challenges that we face in London in terms of helping people. How is the Mayor planning to overcome those challenges? What are we going to do to really start to move ahead on this? We're developing some work at the moment around how we can look to increase the scale of retrofit. In terms of eco, I think again Warmer Homes shows that we've been able to secure more eco as a percentage of the value of the work to date on those jobs than previously we might have managed. And again, I think that's around having the funding in place to make sure that we can secure additional funding. One of the issues being eco is targeted at fuel poor homes, but eco funding will only ever cover a percentage of that of the measures that go into a home, and they won't necessarily cover the cost of things like retrofit coordinators, which we've highlighted why that's important. So by providing that support, we're allowing people to access those measures without contributing their own funding, and for the people that are most in need of that and can't afford to dip into their own pockets to fund the measures. That's sort of really essential. I think we've spoken to people around the country elsewhere, and it's very difficult to fund eco measures fully. So what happens is you end up getting in touch with somebody, providing them with some advice perhaps, but then if you don't have that additional funding, you're ending up having to turn some people away, and this is what we're seeing in other regions. But do you think there's more, I mean, looking away from eco, is there more that we can be doing from the GLA, from the energy efficiency team, to encourage the housing associations to be doing more, both around improving ventilation and insulation, but also giving that energy advice? Is there something more that we could be doing to scale it up? Because I mean, I'm very conscious that Peter said, it was a bit of an issue, and it was something that, you have to keep coming back to, I think, and giving that advice, perhaps more than once to people about some small things that they can do to really help reduce the amount of moisture in the air, which actually then makes it cheaper to heat their home.
I would say in terms of what we've done to date, so the Renew programme, which is technical assistance, predominantly working with social housing providers. A key tenet of that is upskilling and providing capacity to London boroughs and housing associations that perhaps don't have a Liz and a Liz's team in place. And as part of that, we've trained housing officers in these organisations to how they should interact with their tenants and better mitigate some of the problems we've spoke about. I think in terms of bigger picture strategic stuff about how we fund this outside of eco, which, you know, as we know, is really a pittance compared to the scale of the problem. The successor program to renew, which is launching next year, as I've said, it has an entire work stream dedicated to finance and funding. So taking a step back, saying this hasn't worked for London to date, how do we enable a business model, a business case that's attractive to local authorities and housing associations and even private landlords and owner-occupiers to retrofit their homes. So this could be working with the Mayor's Energy Efficiency Fund, looking at the GLA's Green Finance work stream, which is another strand in the environment team now, to come up with new solutions. So it's really to just acknowledge there's a problem there and work out solutions in the coming couple of years that will really set us on the tracks. We don't need to worry about the boom and bust of government funding to really come up with some ideas that will work.
Possibility that we're going to be looking at boroughs using their carbon offset funds that they're now starting to pile up, I guess?
Again, we already are.
Yep.
So Merton has allocated some of its carbon offset funding to support measures in warmer homes. And so what that means is that we can provide a small grant from our own funding. We can top that up with eco, and we can top that up with carbon offset funds.
Great.
And that makes things go a lot further.
Makes it go a lot further.
Yeah.
And is that something we're going to be developing as the funds start to come in?
Yeah, we'd certainly like to, because as you've said, the scale is very large. We're doing a lot, but we need we need to work with others to do more.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Before I bring Onka and Sean, you were indicating just earlier, has the moment passed, or do you still want to?
I think the moment's passed.
Okay, Onka.
Right. Thank you. Before I leave the topic of moulds entirely, the impact of a mould is, of course, is a fungus, which is having a huge amount of impact on people's health. And it's not just ventilation, dampness, but it's how it affects people's lives. So can you just tell us what the health impacts are of mould and dampness on people's lives?
My knowledge of this only really extends to the study that I did, which only asked some very sort of light touch questions on this. We asked about, we only really asked whether there was a person in the home with a respiratory condition. So exactly what that condition was, we didn't necessarily ask. And then when we examined the data from the 260 homes in the project, we didn't get a very clear correlation between the level of infections or conditions with the amount of mould there. So I have to say I can't confidently tell you what the conditions are. All I can say is that what we do know is that with increased condensation, there is also an increased condensation also creates the ideal conditions for dust mites and other allergens as well. So while there is an increase, it's very difficult to actually correlate it from my study, but other people may know more than that.
I'm a director of an organisation called the UK Centre for Moisture in Buildings, which has a very direct interest in exactly that topic. And one of the things that I think we feel is well established is that black mould spores exacerbate respiratory conditions. There's some evidence that they initiate respiratory conditions, but it's not as good as the evidence that it exacerbates. And the problem with the mould spores is they're not just where you can see the black mould, the air in the home is full of those spores because they're effectively invisible. And then there are other health effects that flow from it, because I've watched, for instance, single mums with toddlers in Thamesmead trying to clean the mould off with bleach. And actually keeping the toddler away from the bleach is as much a health risk as the toddler living with the mould spores. So we have some solutions, or there are some intuitive solutions which make it worse or potentially more dangerous. And that kind of leads me to something I wanted to add to the last discussion, really, which is that I think we may be missing a trick on the funding side. There is some evidence from some parts of the country that actually it's cheaper for the health service to help you to improve the homes than it is to treat those conditions once they present with them. So, and that it's a bit patchy, and there are several studies, but they're not in London, they're around the place. But there's, I think, potential for starting to consolidate that work and say to the NHS, it may be more cost effective to help us improve the homes than to actually treat the conditions, and try and lever a little bit of extra funding for serious mould conditions out of NHS trusts in certain areas. I think it's all patchy because of the fact that we're having to work with particular housing organisations and particular trusts, but we might be able to pull that together in a more systematic way.
I'd just like to add to that the Fuel Poverty Partnership, which was established by the Mayor on the back of the Fuel Poverty Action Plan, has that on its agenda, health and the NHS and the related cost. So it's something they're looking at trying to get off the ground as well.
Really, thank you for that, Corey. But let me come to the main question to you, George, particularly about the warmer homes. Can you tell me, it says that this is targeted towards vulnerable people and ill people. What's the definition of vulnerable? Who's vulnerable? Who's entitled to get this money from you?
So the eligibility, so it's actually targeted at fuel poor households, which may include many people in vulnerable positions, which will mean that they either have a disability or a long-term health condition or are particularly vulnerable to cold. So it will cover a number of long-term health conditions or disabilities, potentially. The evidence to date from the programme shows that a large proportion of the applicants to the scheme would fall into those categories. So that's broadly what we mean.
So if I saw a patient who was suffering from asthma, who's a young toddler, whose mother is having difficulty coping with them, they would be classified vulnerable, and they could apply for this funding from you.
Yeah, yeah, potentially. So the eligibility criteria are being in receipt. They're aligned with the energy company obligation, and part of the reason for that is so that we can attract eco funding to the programme. So it's being in receipt of certain benefits, or it's there's also something called flexible eligibility under eco, which is where a local authority can determine what classifies somebody as being fuel poor or vulnerable to cold.
Yeah, when you say certain benefit, what benefits will you have in mind?
There is.
I mean, how if I was listening on the webcast and I wanted to know, can I apply for this? How will I know the answers?
Well, it's all on the GLA's website, so the Warmer Homes website, and I would encourage people to go on there because it's a long list of benefits, and I won't be able to recite them all and be totally confident of listing them all.
Okay, so this is all in the public domain. People can look this up,
yeah,
and they'll know. So if they receive of certain benefits, and what are qualifying tenants, right? I mean, they say people who have qualifying benefit or qualifying tenants. So what's the distinction between those two, please?
So this is for this is for landlords. So where the tenant is in receipt of those benefits, or where they meet the other EcoFlex eligibility criteria, then they can apply. And again, those are in the frequently asked questions on the Warmer Homes website. But you asked a question about what would you do if one of your patients came to you and you thought that they would benefit from the scheme. One thing I'd point out is we haven't had lots of referrals from GPs, but we have had some referrals from GPs. And in a couple of cases, those have been people who, referrals from doctors where people wouldn't have been able to go home because the risk of cold was such that actually it wouldn't have been healthy to discharge them back to that home. So in those cases, we've been able to prioritise measures, and people have been able to go to a warmer home.
I think it may very be beneficial if this is brought to the attention of GPs that this fund exists, because I'm often asked to write letters for my patients who live in damp conditions to the housing association or to the council to get this sorted out. But if I knew right, they only don't know about this funding because I'm here on the assembly. But I think it'd be a useful exercise if you want to get more vulnerable people being referred to you, that this is advertised to the brought to the attention like of CCG, so they can pass it down the information chain, so that we can get more referrals from vulnerable people. So I think that'd be useful. The other thing is, I just want to talk about the targets and delivery. Okay, the targets have been brought down, or the initial targets were thought to be very ambitious, and they were toned down. Why? What made you tone them down?
Sorry, I don't.
Okay. Let me say, the GLA target in 2013 to retrofit the homes was 175,000 in 2013, but the recalculated target was only 40,000.
This is in relation to the Renew programme, so I'll pass it over to Ben.
Yeah, sorry, I think this is completely the Renew programme, not Warmer Homes.
Okay, I'm sorry about that.
So that this is providing technical assistance to landlords essentially, and when the programme was originally scoped up in 2013 and launched in 2014, as you rightly say, the homes target was much higher. What we saw in 2015 and then 16 was swinging government cuts to the main funding schemes. So energy company obligation, you have to forgive me, I can't remember off the top of my head, I believe that might have been cut by around 2/3 at that point. There was a large cut at the same time. David Cameron was quoted saying cut the green stuff. Similarly, we had the feed-in tariff, which was subject to I think around a 60% cut. The tariff enabled households to be paid for electricity from solar panels. So when the programme was scoped in 2014, the independent consultants that worked out these targets thought that, okay, we can achieve this much through these mayoral programmes by using this much energy company obligation funding and encouraging social landlords to take advantage of feed-in tariff funding. And it became apparent after these cuts, because obviously we work with these organisations, the boroughs and the housing associations very closely, that these projects were just no longer financially viable to the same scale. Obviously housing associations, boroughs, they've got other huge pressures just in housing in terms of building new housing is a major pressure. So when the incentives were taken away from the retrofit side of things, we saw a lot of projects and programs get cancelled. We saw a lot of investment pulled back because the match funding wasn't there. And so we had to allow a recalculation of targets to say what would have been reasonable if we'd have known when we were scoping the programme what the funding market was going to be like at the time, and that's why the targets were reduced.
Okay, thank you. And also, looking at the GLA budget for 2019-20, there's been a drop in the amount of money allocated for energy and carbon reduction programmes in 2021, 21-22, and 21-23. Why is the reason for that? Is it because you aren't getting enough? I mean, let me not give you the answer. What is the answer?
I think that's purely that budgets are decided in cycles. So,
sorry, could you speak up?
Budgets are decided in cycles. So that will take us through, I think, through to the end of the mayor's term. I think it's the 2020-21 financial year. So actually, it's not a question of budget being cut. It's more there's no budget confirmed yet.
It's because the funding comes from a government source and the European fund. Is that the reason for it?
No.
No, I don't think it is. Yeah, sorry, I think this is slightly outside of the scope of what we've prepared this question, so I don't think we're going to be able to give you a brilliant answer, I'm afraid. We can come back to you afterwards.
Could you write to the committee with a response on that,
absolutely,
please?
Yeah. It's not to do with external government cuts or anything like that, though. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to chip in on that? Yes, I saw Peter indicating.
Just sort of wanted to add one point, which is that housing associations have got a lot of goodwill to get their homes improved, but not a lot of resource. And if you look at the way, I mean, this is a kind of political point that the committee might want to take up, look at the way the regulatory regime for housing associations works. The regulator very strongly discourages housing associations from borrowing to improve their stock. It encourages them to borrow to build new, because that's the government's policy. So, you know, a housing association that wants to improve its stock, wants to raise funding on the market to do so is actually strongly discouraged by the regulator. And I think that's something that the committee might want to talk to the regulator about and see if they can discuss that and why they're doing it. It's clearly quite political, but it seems to me to be blocking. It's also making our housing associations development rich and asset management poor in many cases.
If you can provide, if you have any information on this or any example, it'd be useful if you share it with the chair.
I mean, it's certainly a very interesting idea, and we can look at it when we're looking at our recommendations. So thank you for that. Sean, can I bring you in now?
Afternoon. I just want to address my initial comments to George, and everybody else can pile in afterwards, is the words I'm looking for. The warmer homes pilot for private rented sector had begun in the 1st of November. What are the additional challenges for this part of the programme, in that is for private rented homes?
Simply just from a process point of view, you have two sets of people that you need to get approvals from. So you need approvals from a landlord and a tenant, which sometimes can be a bit more difficult to arrange. If a landlord's not really engaged with that, then it's problematic. That also means, simple things like two sets of GDPR, so data compliance statements that you need to get from people. It's also things like getting a state aid check on landlords. So those are some of the sort of more mundane, straightforward things. I think more widely, there's a split incentive between landlords wanting to invest in their homes and taking an interest in the energy performance of their homes because they don't see themselves as the ones who get the benefit. Actually, potentially they do get the benefit because they get more satisfied tenants. They might get a home that's more marketable, potentially. So we don't necessarily think that all the benefits accrue to the tenant, but that's been an issue in the past. And I think because of that split incentive, engaging landlords and getting their attention is problematic. So, but I think to date we've been quite pleased with the response that we've seen from private tenants and landlords. In order to get around this issue, this logistical issue of the approvals, what we require is that if it's a landlord applying, then they have the tenant's consent and they've provided evidence of that, and vice versa. But despite that could sometimes be a bit of a barrier. But actually we've still had a reasonable number of applications so far, which is pleasing. I'd say another barrier is just over things like agreeing works and that sort of thing, because in the same way that, you need two sets of approvals to apply, you then need to get those things signed off by kind of both tenant and landlord. And dealing with lots of different people adds time, it can add cost, and it can mean that things take a bit longer.
Okay. How is the pilot going to work in relation to minimum energy efficiency standards?
Well, at the moment, the landlord is there's a cap on what a landlord can be required to spend, and that cap includes any other available funding. As funding is available, then it can contribute to those costs. So at the moment, minimum energy efficiency standards don't really have that much of a bearing. But I think it will be interesting to see how those are applied in the longer term, and whether or not in future phases of schemes that we'd need to look at tightening those criteria. But I think at the moment, because there are so many barriers, we didn't want to put too many additional barriers in and be too stringent about it, because ultimately the aim of the programme is to help fuel poor homes, and it's the tenant that's fuel poor, it's not the landlord. Okay.
Is there a way you'd like to see them applied? Are you forming some thinking around that?
Well, I think what a large number of people wanted to see is a higher cap, as a higher requirement on landlords to spend on homes to bring them up to that standard.
Okay, but there's a tension there, because the worry is if your landlord pays out more, you as the tenant end up paying out more. There's a tension there.
Potentially, but I think part of it's around speaking to landlords around what the benefits are to them, which is they have a better home, is looking after the longer term health of their asset, I know that in other local authorities across other parts of the country, they've had great success in engaging landlords around a narrative of looking after your asset rather than looking at the immediate costs of that work. They've had some success in that.
Are we having the same success here? It sounds like we're not even having that conversation.
Whether our borough partners are, I don't know. Some of our borough partners might be having those sorts of conversations. But we're not directly liaising with landlords, so no.
Okay. How will a pilot be assessed? How did you decide who to target? And how will the overall pilot be assessed?
Well, to a certain extent, it's a lot of the referrals to the scheme are driven through the work that we're doing with boroughs. So, Shine, for example, which is a Seasonal Health Interventions Network, which is run by Islington, is one of the parties that we're funding through the Fuel Poverty Support Fund. People will come to them, so they'll put themselves forward, but also they will, through other referrals from, potentially from GPs, but from community groups as well, they'll identify people who are eligible for the scheme. So that's really how we do it. It's through outreach work with boroughs, identifying people that may be suitable for the scheme and encouraging them to apply.
Are you keeping track of where people are, a map of, of where referrals are coming from,
yeah.
Boroughs you're working with? Is there any trend? Is it all in or out, or is it just across London?
It's across London, really. Some boroughs will have had fewer referrals than others. A lot of that comes down to borough resource. So where boroughs have been able to support community groups, in particular, then referrals will tend to be higher because they have that network of people on the ground who are working directly with people on a day-to-day basis, and they can see whether they're suitable or not for the scheme and encourage them to apply. Where you don't have those sort of levels of resources, applications tend to be a bit lower. It also depends on the housing stock of the borough as well, and what the mix of tenure is, and what the mix of incomes is, which obviously varies fairly dramatically both inside and around out of London.
Because of course the worry is, if you're in some of the poorer areas, you may be less likely to have those community groups that access. I live in a part of London where there's lots of elderly people. I think Havering is the greatest older population in London. I don't sense that same activity, but I do sense that same need. Can something be done to help boroughs where the footprint isn't quite the same with the network?
Well, we are encouraging all boroughs to work with us. It really does come down to an extent to what levels of resources boroughs have, but separately we've also engaged with a number of food banks across London and a number of AGK organisations across London, and also job centres across London. I'd say that in some of the areas where fuel poverty is highest and deprivation is highest, even though there's a couple of boroughs where even though there isn't any formal network that we know of, I think some of the community networks are quite strong, and therefore applications have been quite high. So word of mouth is another way that people hear about the scheme, and that's sort of one of the highest ones if we look at where people heard about the scheme. It's a very high number of people from local authorities, high numbers from community groups, and a lot of people just from word of mouth. So I think that's encouraging, although I think we'd like to see greater coverage across London.
How many people do you expect the pilot to involve?
A minimum of 1,106 homes, so 1,106 homes for warmer homes. I think it's about 2,000 for the Fuel Poverty Support Fund. So separate initiatives, but they are linked in that the Fuel Poverty Support Fund is designed to build that capacity amongst boroughs and community groups to identify people, but then also provide referrals to warmer homes. So we think having a sort of a sustainable network that is in place that can help identify people that's local, grassroots level is one of the best ways of identifying the people most in need who might not be reached by traditional advertising campaigns.
Okay. And just to return to a theme spoken about earlier on, to what extent does this have any sort of education piece in it?
In terms of teaching people about the benefits of what the measures might be, or teaching them about energy use in their home.
All of that,
Yeah.
avoiding damp, is that embedded in it? Is it only the community groups to deliver that? To what extent is that part of the pilot?
No, it's very much embedded in it. It's the same as the remainder of the warmer homes scheme. So every job has a retrofit coordinator, and it's the job of that retrofit coordinator to look at what the measures are, but also make sure that people are happy with measures and speak to them about the issues they have in their homes and how they can get the most out of the measures that are being installed as well.
Okay.
Sean, before I bring Navin in, I just wanted to ask Peter and Bill if you had any thoughts on the private rented sector, which we've just been discussing, in terms of retrofit in the private rented sector specifically, if there are any particular issues, if you're aware of any kind of good projects that we should be aware of, good examples.
I have a strategic point, which is that both the fuel poverty regulations and the minimum energy efficiency standards suggest a kind of incremental improvement in EPC rating over the period up to 2030. And I've always thought that was kind of mad. Why would you take your G-rated home and make it a D and then have to go round again in 2025, do some more work to it to get to a B? And if we could do more integrated packages, which is what George was talking about at the beginning, we could get it to a B all the way early on and not have to go back. So it's a little bit to do with the politics and logistics of deploying the resource, clearly. But it is not very efficient to go round several times. Mm-hmm. But the regulations are set up in such a way that organisations like landlords with limited resources are going to have to do it in several bites. It'd be quite good to find some mechanisms where we can encourage people to get all the way to B in one go, not disrupt the household twice, use the kind of the resources a bit more efficiently, and actually try and build some headroom in as well, because those regulation standards are based on predictions by BEIS of what the fuel costs that households are likely to experience will be in 2025, 2030, and they've always been wrong so far. Mm-hmm. So a little bit of headroom so that we don't discover that we've done all this work which is around fuel poverty, and in 2028, 2030 we discover that actually we've been running like crazy and only just keeping up.
So are there sort of specific things that you're I mean, for instance, the quiet ventilation that nobody fiddles with the sort of mechanical extraction and throughput of air, is that sort of demand based in terms of humidity? Is that the kind of thing that you're thinking about for the private rented sector? Or
yeah, I think all good measures that are robust, that don't go wrong, that don't get us lots of callbacks, anything that's not done well. I had a conversation with some BEIS officials last week about they were talking about their view of the cost of doing things properly and doing it with good technologies like that, and they were saying the cost of complaints, callbacks, fixing defects, remediation, redress for households who've had damage done, and some of them have health damage done, is so huge, but it's quite hidden. And their view was, if we ought to be spending a little bit more up front on doing it well and robustly and using the standards, rather than trying to get the most sort of bang out of our buck at this stage. But the regulations are written to sort of drive us in that direction if we're not careful.
But Peter, what would the implication be on cost? Would there be any cost implication for doing what you're suggesting? The suggestion from the BEIS guys was that doing things well to a good standard doesn't cost any more in the long run. Because the cost but what about an immediate? Because
immediate capital cost, you'd have to spend more and do less homes. And so I understand that that's always a dilemma. You know, do you spread the money thinly, or do you go for some really serious problems and put a lot of it in?
Because that's the question, isn't it? Because we sit in many committees and people talk about things that are gently drifting in the right direction, want to push it harder, but that is always that tension, and particularly with the private rented thing, the thing that always worries me with the private rented sector, if you force a regulation on them, you can guarantee it's the tenants who will be paying in the short and the long term. So there's a tension there. You always want to meter that out. But of course, you're correct. You don't have to keep going round and round and round. But as a renter, I might think, well, I won't be paying for the second round. I'd rather keep the cost low now. So we need to find a way of selling it. It's why I was very interested in the education piece, because I think people will pay for things more readily if they understand the benefit. Yes. But the regulation needs to understand that as well. It's interesting what you're saying, but I think I would like to understand what the cost implication would be, because it'd be easier to support if you realise it's a 5% extra cost as opposed to 45%, if you see what I mean.
Well, I think that the arrival of the past 2030 standard, past 2035 standard, will force people to do that cost work.
Okay.
I also think that the industry will respond to the money being conditioned that way quite quickly, and will reorganise itself to deliver more measures at once. And that will build efficiencies in that aren't there now. So I think that we shouldn't think that everything's kind of ossified into a particular way of doing things.
Okay.
You change the way the money is labelled or conditioned, and it will change the way the industry responds, and the schemes will respond too. So I think we just need to be flexible about that and try and do some whole house work to very good standards to lead the way, as well as making sure the resource is well distributed across those that need it. And clearly that's a balance that we have to strike. And sort of the work that George has been doing in particular is all about exactly that. How do we deploy these resources in the most cost-effective way?
So George and Ben, that leads to the obvious question. What can we do with the power we have here, the Mayor, the GLA, to bring some of that deeper thinking, that forward thinking, that preventative work?
Sean, I think this is probably national. This is probably us pushing for national policy rather than necessarily what the GLA team.
No, I'm saying is that something the GLA team is? If that's the answer, is that something the GLA team should be saying, should be doing, should be encouraging the Mayor to do?
I think we've said already through Warmer Homes. Actually, we are leading the way in terms of putting in place best practice that isn't legislation yet, and that's really important to build up capacity in the supply chain and to start getting the supply chain to change. So I'd say we're already doing that.
Okay.
And I would also say in this successor programme to Renew, we're doing the same thing. So whereas previously we'd be encouraging landlords to just do the simple measures, the single measures, what they could afford. Under the new programme, we've actively got a target where it is whole house retrofit. It is looking at the bigger picture. We're looking at a 60% carbon reduction on average per home that we're trying to encourage and help people to fund and technically be able to do in their homes. So yeah, I think we are completely going down that route.
Okay, thank you.
Can I bring in Navin now?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Excuse me. Ben, on Mayor's programme as such, can you tell us how is Mayor helping people in social housing who are experiencing damp?
How they're experiencing, helping them, how they're experiencing damp. So our main interaction with social housing is through the Renew programme, and as I've said, through the programme that will succeed it next year. So I think there's two main ways that Renew helps social housing landlords and by extension their tenants with problems with damp, mould and cold homes. The first one is, as I've said, it's central tenet of Renew is technical assistance. So it's bridging this capacity gap. It's filling any lack of expertise where the social landlord doesn't perhaps have someone like Liz's team in place. The consultants from Renew in effect perform that role. And so we, as I say, the two things is firstly filling that gap by showing the landlords, whether it's the housing officers or property maintenance teams, how they can mitigate the effects of poor retrofit, how they can do retrofit well, how they can avoid damp, and as I've said, we've also done some training for housing officers. And I think that the second way is we developed, the Renew programme developed something called the Retrofit Risk Toolkit, which is, I think I'd say, an industry leading toolkit which looks at how you do retrofit and avoid these unintended consequences that can happen, like overheating or, as we're talking about now, damp and mould from poorly installed retrofit. That's a toolkit that we encourage all social landlords we work with to use to make sure they do get good quality retrofit when they come to do it, and their tenants are less likely to suffer these unintended consequences. I think it's fair to say that the toolkit, you've been involved with it, have you not, Peter?
I helped you, the original Renew team, to build it, to develop it.
Yeah, and I think I'm right to say it's been actually rolled out wider across the country. Others have looked at it. And the new standards you talked about earlier, they...
A lot of learning from the first phase of Renew is in the new standards for that. So in many ways, GLA has been contributing to development of good practice.
Yeah, I think finally I'd say we did a research report a couple of years ago called the Business Case for Retrofit. It was along the same lines as Touching the Void. So Bill's report that he spoke of, Sustainable Homes, did a couple of years earlier, which looked at how much less likely social landlords are to suffer complaints from their tenants and repairs costs from damp and mould related issues if you get your retrofit right. So I think that's probably the third way. So we have done actively, strategically, and through technical toolkits helping social tenants to avoid the issues of damp. And in the new programme we want to make that even more explicit through, as I said, higher quality retrofit, whole house retrofit, a more holistic approach.
How are you measuring effectiveness of the program?
So in terms of warmer homes, we have, because we capital fund measures rather than try and leverage in the funding from these organisations, we have a much stronger hand in verifying and following up any potential issues. When Renew was set up, and as you may know, was 90% funded by the European Investment Bank, it really was driven by these key performance indicators on carbon, number of homes and capital expenditure leveraged. So there was no provision to essentially go in after the homes have been retrofitted and do any kind of like post-occupancy evaluation. We would always encourage the social landlords that we work with to do such an exercise, and I know some of them have done, and they've found very positive results from their tenants, and a lot of them, as I'm sure Liz could tell you, when they've done capital works on retrofit, they will follow up with tenants to make sure that there aren't these unintended consequences, that the energy bill savings are hopefully being made, and that the tenants are warmer. But from the Renew programme itself, unlike warmer homes, there's no active following up to check on these kind of things. For the successor programme, the London Homes Energy Efficiency Programme, launching next year, we are specifying that monitoring and verification plans will be put in place. Otherwise, we won't count them towards key performance indicators. So we will have mechanisms in place to monitor and make sure that there aren't any unintended consequences, or if there are, that we know about them.
Before I invite other members of the panel to add any more on this, can you also tell us whether, during sort of running this program, if you had any gaps or barriers in implementing or running the program, such as engagement issues with local authorities or housing associations, or to do with funding, or any of the technical measures in implementing?
Okay. I might bring in George on this as well, because he's various experience in this area and has worked on Renew. But I would say the main barriers we've encountered on Renew, as we said, there is the capacity gap. That's one of the main reasons that Renew was actually brought about, to help these boroughs and housing associations to have this technical expertise to bring these retrofit projects into being. But some of the boroughs have suffered so many cuts. Some of the housing associations have perhaps had to change their priorities as new build becomes more and more the overarching priority. So sometimes it's not even the person to get a foot in the door with and say, yes, here's some technical assistance, we can help you work up these projects. There's not even the team there to engage with. So that's a big barrier. Secondly, funding, as we spoke about, Renew in particular was its success was very predicated on having access to these higher levels of energy company obligation funding, potentially working with private households, bringing in the Green Deal, which, as we've discussed, didn't really get off the ground, the feed-in tariff in terms of feed-in PV. Those funding streams have all been quite heavily over the last 4 years. I mean, and it's a huge blow to the boroughs, to the housing associations, when their finance director before could, for example, having a estate of 250 homes done. I'm just thinking of one I worked up in particular. This is in Leicester, that in the heyday of the energy company obligation, we managed to do external wall insulation, windows and roofs, and the project was 65% plus funded from the energy company obligation. When you go back to a finance director in these organisations and say the same, but we're only offering them 10 or 15% funding, and they say, well, perhaps that doesn't stack up for me, and I'm not sure of the wider benefits, which is another argument we need to win. So I'm going to put this money into other priorities, such as building new homes. So yeah, I think it's a huge barrier.
Does anybody else want to come in?
I'd like to just say, I'd like to just say how invaluable the Renew programme has been for us. I mean, we have dedicated resource in-house, and they still plug so many gaps for us in terms of being a sort of a friendly ear to just talk about, our ideas and what we want to do. The sort of balance and unbiased, which is really helpful. And also the procurement framework has been very helpful in terms of making the process easier of actually appointing contractors. So they've been really, really helpful in getting some of our projects off the ground.
Thank you, Liz.
I would reinforce that, actually. It seems to me that housing organisations have in general lost technical expertise and tended to retreat behind procurement procedures that leave the technicalities to contractors and design and build contractors and people like that. And what Renew's been able to do is to put the technical expertise back in to the top of the process and get the direction right to start with. So it has that great value, I think.
Ben, having talked about some of the barriers, etc., that you faced, is this something which is being reflected in how you're sort of running the successor Renew program?
Yeah, I think so. So the Renew program had an independent evaluation about a year ago by some very expert consultants. And so aside from the evaluation and lessons learned from that report, they also helped us out with a forward strategy. So, assessing other programs in Europe and throughout the world, lessons learned, what could a really good successor program look like. So we've taken on board those kind of lessons, and the successor program is structured around some of those key points to help get us over the barriers. So I think I mentioned earlier, there's a dedicated work stream on finance and funding, so we're not at the mercy of external funding from the government or anyone else. We're looking at how we can create these self-sustaining business models that would hopefully be attractive to social housing providers, but also landlords, private landlords and owner-occupiers. Another key thing I think that was identified was the fact that I think as Peter said earlier, we're looking at going from a EPC band G, which is the worst, to maybe a EPC band D currently, which is kind of medium. Why aren't we going for a B? Why aren't we why are we going to have to go back again and again doing these incremental improvements when it would be far better for the tenant and far better for the building itself if we could do it all as a holistic package in one? So that's something else the new program is going to try and do, like this holistic whole house deep retrofit. I would say the multi-tenure thing as well, stopping that being such a barrier. Nowadays you see quite a bit of pepper potting. If you can walk down some streets in London and see external wall insulation on some properties and not for others, and it may be that that's a housing association road, but there's a couple of owner-occupiers or private householders, and that has technical risks in terms of cold bridging between the houses, which can lead to more damp and cold issues, as we know. Doesn't look nice for the streetscape, and it also means that sometimes perhaps you have people living in cold homes alongside people living in warmer homes. So another facet of the new program is to look at how we can enable more like, you know, whole estate, whole street, whole block retrofit, so nobody misses out. So it is more holistic from that perspective too.
Can I just come in there, because that's different from what we were hearing earlier about targeting the homes with over-occupancy, where there's specific problems with damp and mould and condensation. So how does that tension between those two play out? I mean, I don't know whether Peter or Bill want to...
Quick one, Peter,
Yeah.
then to you. So I think I mentioned earlier like a baseline to enable people to you know, live adequately, heat their homes reasonably well, and have a good chance of ventilating them right. So I think that's what we're talking about there, as in, you know, fitting the baseline. If we can make the homes insulated well enough and have a corresponding level of ventilation in there that works well enough, then we can look at the occupancy side a bit more. But if you don't even give them that baseline choice, and people just can't afford to put the heating on, then you know, you're still going to have people either fuel poor or with damp and cold homes. So I think that's the kind of angle I was saying. But Peter, you can...
I don't think taking a whole house approach is incompatible with prioritising the way you deploy the resources. You have the whole house approach and you end up with a plan for what this house needs over the next 20 or 30 years, and you can afford to do as much of it as you can now, and some of it comes later. And you can still, within that process, prioritise certain households or dwelling types or whatever it is that you need to do. So I think it's just the richness of the plan needs to accommodate that way of doing things. I mean, I always say that retrofit goes wrong at the corners, junctions and edges and interfaces. George has heard me say this lots of times, and actually that's why doing things in little bites doesn't work very well, because you create too many corners, junctions, edges and interfaces. The more you can kind of wrap the whole house up and make everything work together, the better.
More of a holistic.
Yeah, so I'm quite encouraged actually to listen to George and Ben talking about moving the industry, because I think programs that have that emphasis will move the industry towards a more holistic approach, and that I think we need to be leading in that direction.
My final question is about the target numbers for successor program for Renew project. The program states that the target of reaching 1,678 homes. Why are these numbers so significantly less than the current Renew program targets?
Thank you. Yeah, appreciate it. Looks on the surface a magnitude of order smaller. So yeah, I'm glad you asked the question and gave us a chance to explain it. So, as I said, these homes that we're trying to do, the relatively smaller number in this 3-year programme, we want them to be models for going forward for what London does in the next 10, 20, 30 years, to help us mitigate fuel poverty, to help us reach our zero carbon by 2050 targets. So we're not going crazy with the number of homes, and the European Regional Development Fund, who are 50% funder, have agreed to these relatively lower targets because we're focusing on quality, real quality, unlike you know, as I think we discussed over the last hour and a half in terms of these single measures funded quickly and installed potentially badly just because there was a bit of energy company obligation funding here. We're looking at as setting a template and a blueprint for what comes after. So we try and do work with housing providers to put quite a lot of faith and spend quite a lot of money, because you know, deeper retrofit can be significantly more expensive, as we know. To do a smaller number of homes but do them right, and then we can say to other London boroughs who perhaps haven't got involved this time, or other housing associations, hey look, we work perhaps with L&Q and we did this 400 home estate, and now the tenants are paying only a third of what fuel bills that they were paying. The damp and condensation has been monitored, and it's far reduced. They look better from the outside. We want to really show that this can be done, retrofit can be done in an attractive manner. So you can go to the finance directors, the chief executives, and say, you don't have to just be, building these shiny new homes. You have a lot of homes now that you can improve and, and really make a difference to the tenants. So I think, in a nutshell, it's a smaller ambition within the 3 years, but it's about doing it right and then rolling it out far, far wider. So in the years after these 3 years, you're doing thousands and thousands and thousands more.
So it's not about resources, it's about scope of the works and the quality and standard you're setting for the future program to follow.
Yeah, that's very nicely summarised. Thank you.
Yeah.
And perhaps, just come in there, you seem to also be saying it would be like an exemplar for, members of the G15 and G320 and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's what we hope. I mean, there are partners in this, and I think as Peter says, housing associations and a lot of the boroughs, they are very keen and willing, but it is difficult and it can be expensive to get it right, and nobody wants to take too much of a risk on doing something wrong, because it is an intervention. It is disrupting someone's life. So we want to get it right. We want to work with these housing partners and give them as much support as we can through this technical assistance program, and say to them, look, here's a funding and finance model that works for this. Here are your technical options for doing this. Here's how you can monitor it, and then hopefully everything works to the highest standards as Peter and Bill have described. We can roll it out much further.
And I guess both the local authorities and housing associations directly themselves do not have the expertise in terms of technical specifications and the whole package, how to come about. So that's where, again, by providing this, you are setting that standard as well, and therefore enabling those authorities to deliver a better quality.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, it's the same the same kind of ethos as helping these organisations who already have some great people, but perhaps they're too stretched. It's about building the capacity, expanding their expertise, learning from each other.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, just before I bring you in, Tony, Sean, you indicated did you want to say something briefly?
It just ask a question, really. You talk about retrofit. You almost said retrofit versus new, that you could show local authorities they didn't just need to build shiny new things, they could retrofit. I mean, that feels like a whole can of worms to me. Yeah. But have you looked at what is better to retrofit? Because it would seem to me that, to take your point, that the problems are at the joins. If you build a completely new place with new building regs, you stand a much better chance of getting this right than retrofit. That's a question. Am I wrong or am I right?
I think it's a good question, and one that could be looked at. I think it's a really big debate, probably wider than the scope of what we're looking here in terms of the regeneration versus retrofit agenda. It's something the UK Green Building Council are looking at and have a working group. And it's certainly contentious in terms of, people love their old estates, and but at the same time, sometimes boroughs and housing associations could look at them and do options appraisal and say, is it worth us improving them, or should we knock them down and start again, as you say? There is a lot of tension there, as I say. It's probably wider than the scope of this. I don't know if
I think you're right. We've had a big discussion recently about embodied carbon, which took us into the retrofit or rebuild.
No, I asked the question because obviously it's public funds, and if retrofit is the way to do it, then we should do it. And if rebuilding is a way, then we do that way. But your fund is retrofitting things, so surely you must have some kind of idea of which buildings we should focus those funds on to understand what we're doing, because we don't just want to retrofit a building, and it would have been better for the residents to give them a new one. Because I have lived in many a damp place, and one building that I used to live in called 11 Faraday House, I believe was beyond rescue. And I was right, because they knocked it down. We might be getting into too much personal anecdote here. No, but it's important to people to understand, if you're going to retrofit my estate, that might be the one chance I have to not live in damp damp accommodation. So it's very important that you either, somebody understands what's better, retrofit or rebuild.
It's potentially both, and it's finding the right solution for the right homes. So an example of an organisation that we're working with through the Energy Leap project, Sutton Housing Partnership, are currently looking at one of their estates, and they're doing that options appraisal, because in some cases, you know, it might be better to retrofit, in some cases it might be better to rebuild, but it's important that the right process is undergone, and it's important that both on the new build side of things and on the retrofit side of things, we find business models that make things viable over the course of their life, which means that they generate more revenue than they cost up front. And that can be true both of retrofit and of new build. And I think when you have projects that are viable and investable, you can lever in more finance. There's plenty of sources of finance if you can find the evidence and the quality of the project to make sure that they deliver what they say they're going to deliver.
Okay, I didn't hear that concept in the conversation we were having beforehand.
Yeah, sorry, Sean, I should say the first step in anything we do would be a stock analysis to, you know, identify those ones that definitely shouldn't be touched, or needs a wider conversation within the organisation about the future of these buildings, whether to retain and improve or to regenerate or do something else.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Can I just, again, before I bring Tony in, have any of you seen examples of new build where the problem of condensation and black mould and damp has been an issue?
Yes, quite a few.
So,
I mean, I do sort of troubleshooting of problems and defect problems for a couple of big housing associations, and it's usually construction quality issues. Yep. It's to do with patchy insulation, things that aren't joined up, bits that have been left out for one reason or another, or not understanding ventilation, or residents turning the ventilation off. It's the same issues. Mm-hmm. And I think a point, just to pick up the last thing that Sean was asking, retrofit is new. The real difference between new build and retrofit is it's relatively new. And 10 years ago, when we started to think about doing retrofit at any kind of scale, we were using new build techniques, new build materials and products, and new build people. And what we've discovered is that it's different. It's different materials, different products, different processes, different skills, and there are people in the houses. So altogether, it's a different kind of game. And it's taken the industry quite a long time. And, you know, Ben mentioned learning several times during the things you've said, and I think he's absolutely right. We are still learning how to do retrofit properly. And so we will get, just as we get defects in new build, we will get things that go wrong. And I don't think anybody's in a position yet, even with all the new standards and things, to promise that we won't have some retrofit problems. We will. There's still probably 10 years to go before we really understand how to do it properly.
Brilliant, thank you. Tony, can I bring you in now?
Well, finally, is it conceivable, and I think this is probably one for Ben and George, is it conceivable that you might be making matters worse by introducing some of these programs? In other words, some might turn out to be counterproductive.
I'd say not the way that we're setting the programs up and not the way that we're doing them. I think it's, you know, it's possible, but actually the approach that we take is to assess what the risks are, to use the huge range of knowledge that we have, to bring in expertise from people like Peter where we can. And actually, if you do all those things and you evaluate properties in the right way, then you shouldn't really end up with those issues. And actually, that's what the new London Homes Energy Efficiency Programme is all about. And that's also the approach that we take through Warmer Homes.
Well, on the assumption then that because of all this acquired knowledge that you have, you're not going to make any mistakes.
I said that we are.
I've listened to the initial answers I got, and that was a clear inference. Because of the accumulation of knowledge that you have, you're not going to make any mistakes.
I didn't say we wouldn't make any mistakes. I said we'd minimise the chance of mistakes happening.
Yeah, and I think the standards, the procedures, all the stuff that these guys are building into Renew and the other programs are all about codifying the experience we've had right back to Retrofit for the Future and kind of building it into processes to stop us making mistakes. But that doesn't mean we've found all the things that can go wrong yet. We've probably found most of them, but I don't think anybody would give you a guarantee that we won't have something that goes wrong.
With this accumulation of expertise and knowledge you have, does that mean that
the programmes are going to be cheaper. For example, you will know the best ways of retrofitting. Does that mean that each unit which is retrofitted should cost less?
In the longer term, that's what we'd hope. But I'd go back to the point that I made earlier, that where you don't take into account those sorts of things, there's another cost somewhere, and whether that's the cost of the health service, a cost of the building owner, a cost of the occupants in terms of their health, then there's always an additional cost. But potentially with scale and with learning, yes, you should be able to drive down costs.
Yes, but at the moment, costs are going the other way because we've been doing retrofit with eco money, which is probably only adequate to do 2/3 of the cost of doing it properly. So far, the amount that the energy companies are prepared to spend on a measure under eco is quite a lot less than they ought to spend to do it properly. And so we're having to put the standards in place to make them do it properly so the costs will go up or the number of deliveries will go down a bit for a few years until we get the economies of scale out of the programmes, and then we'll be able to get back to the sort of numbers we've got now. But I couldn't honestly say it's going to get better before it gets worse in terms of costs.
No, I think that last answer has teased out the second question I was supposed to ask. Thank you very much.
In which case, so that, yes, of course.
I mean, clearly, because, we're also now in a phase of removing insulation because of some problems and issues associated with the insulation applied at Grenfell. So I think we can all agree that it's going to get worse before it gets better. But I just wanted to come back to the issue of funding. And the Mayor obviously has some very large budgets where he goes and talks to, particularly the members of the G15, but also councils and property developers across London. And that's then allocated on the basis of a sort of matrix of what they're going to spend it on. Do you think there would be any mileage to making part of that discussion, what they're planning to do in terms of investment into their existing stock, as well as their plans for how they're actually going to spend that money in terms of, you know, delivering properties for London Living Rent or for sale or whatever else?
I think it would be entirely sensible, but maybe it's a better place for someone external to comment.
I think I agree. You factor in all the considerations, really. There is a problem that sometimes higher policy distorts things and you get unintended outcomes. I mean, I think some of the retrofit disasters we've had, not so much Grenfell, but things like Preston and cavity wall failures and so on, have been about pushing too hard at high policy level to do too much, too quickly or too cheaply. And so kind of stepping back and just having a balanced view about where the resources go is probably wise.
Because my feeling is that in the past we have also had sort of previous rushes towards new build and lots of new developments, particularly after the 89 Act, and there was a sort of big shift in housing associations towards more new build and away from what they'd traditionally done, which was much more about purchasing properties and then improving them. And I just wonder, and then we actually went through a whole period where we then tried to up that investment through the Decent Homes programmes and management and maintenance allowances being altered. And I just wonder whether we need to somehow create more of a balance between our need for new properties to meet housing need, but at the same time our need to make sure that we're doing proper investment into existing homes to make sure that people whose housing need has been met, but they are warm, comfortable, dry, able to heat their homes at a cost they can afford and not suffering from mould and damp.
I completely agree with you with that. And I think there's a good example in the way the regulator and quite a lot of consultants work with housing organisations on the value of their stocks. And a lot of kind of asset management models that big consultancies offer will work out the net present value of dwellings. And then those consultants will recommend that if the net present value is negative, they should be disposed of rather than invested in. Well, that makes very good sense if you're a banker. It doesn't make a lot of sense if you've got a homelessness problem. And the problem is that when those properties are disposed of, they're normally sold to private landlords who have less ability to improve them than the housing associations do.
And possibly less desire in some cases.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's a consequence of partly of the regulator's attitude and partly of, I think, poor advice from consultants whose approach to the whole thing is entirely financial rather than financial and technical. And what we could end up with is a load of disposed properties in the hands of private landlords who are much harder to get at to help them to improve them.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Well, that leaves me to bring this conversation towards a close. I just wanted to, I think the most important thing that I've taken away from this has just been the fact that people live in homes, and that's what makes all of these programs, there isn't one perfect, one size fits all thing. Buildings are all different. Even buildings built at the same time by the same developer, they will have particular flaws and problems. So it seems that there's a massive need for flexibility. But I just wanted to ask each of you if there was one thing that you thought you could change in this area that would really help make sure that people could live in good homes that were fit for living in, washing, cooking, drying your clothes, and that weren't going to end up unfit to live in. And, like many of us, I have seen some really shocking examples of homes just covered, walls and furniture covered in black mould. If you had a magic wand and one thing, what would it be that you would want to change? Who wants to go first?
Go first. There's so many things, obviously, but for me, the one really, really big thing would be data, much better data. And I mean that in its widest possible sense. I mean it in terms of what people's attitudes and needs are towards their homes. I mean much more in-depth data about buildings, which allows you to specify the solutions better and minimise those risks that we've talked about. I think it also means data about things like repairs for housing associations and whether that can be linked with energy performance of homes, which then helps to make the business case that then helps to bring forward the investment. So fantastic. In many, many different ways, data.
Data.
Yeah.
Liz?
I'm going to be cheeky and have two, sorry. Funding is obviously really difficult for us because we have to balance it against all of our other budgets and having reliable external funding as well. We're putting together some reports at the moment on eco and what we think could potentially be done around that. And minimum energy efficiency standards for housing associations, because the minimum of E only relates to the private rented sector.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. It was minimum
energy efficiency standards for social housing.
Lease for social housing.
Because the PRS minimum doesn't actually relate to us at the moment. So.
Fantastic. Bill?
I was also going to mention the minimum energy efficiency standards. I think that it's a great piece of legislation, provided it can be enforced. Enforcement is a real issue where there's a shortage of housing, where residents will move into somewhere and won't necessarily ask for an energy performance certificate, or if they demand one from their landlord, they may be told that they're not going to get one, or might be evicted. So I think that unscrupulous landlords and people who are not going to upgrade their homes need to have some kind of control and regulation.
So a bit of regulation and enforcement. Who hasn't gone? Ben?
My one was going to be pretty much akin to Bill and Liz on improved legislation and enforcement. So what we've got isn't bad, but it's 2018. Nobody should be living in homes like this that are the faults of the buildings. We know the occupancy angle is a different kettle of fish perhaps, but can be helped with education and the right tools. But yeah, I think legislation and regulation to ensure that there is this kind of baseline of a good home that all being well with the occupant shouldn't suffer damp and cold excessively.
Thank you. And Peter?
Well, all of these guys have nicked something I was going to say.
Of course.
I think I would say encourage all housing organisations across London to adopt the Trustmark quality mark and the new PAS standards, so that we're kind of assuring quality in the work that's done, because we don't want to go around twice and put it right.
Fantastic. Thank you all very, very much indeed. Now, if I can just ask the committee to note the scoping document for the cold and damp homes investigation,
Okay.
note the discussion we've had this afternoon and the report, and delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with the party group lead members to agree any output arising from this discussion.
Agreed.
Thank you very much. And can I also ask the committee to consider how it will take forward the Assembly's opposition to the expansion of Heathrow Airport, including the discussion at the current meeting on carbon emissions. Sorry? The previous meeting, thank you very much. I just thought, previous meeting on carbon emissions from aviation, and note the previously agreed work programme for the 2018-19 Assembly year as set out in the report.
Agreed.
Thank you very much. And finally, if you could note the date of our next meeting, which is scheduled for the 16th of January at 10 o'clock in Committee Room 5 at City Hall. Thank you very much. And there is no other business, so I bring the meeting to an end. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
GLA Chamber Sound. 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 GLA, chamber, 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 sound.